Hi everyone, it's Alex, and this is my January wrap-up. For January, I knew that I wanted to try a much more balanced set of books I wanted to read in the new year, between reading fiction, nonfiction, graphic novels, short story collections, and one novella. And the first book I wanted to talk about, and one I was quite taken with, was Near to the Wild Heart by Clarice Lispector. I read this in between and during my flights on the way to Alabama earlier this month, and it's quite a slim work, although I know it's, a lot of people talk about it as Clarice Lispector's sort of book that put her on the map, and mainly because when I hear people talk about it, they mention that Clarice Lispector was only 23 whenever it was published. And I know that airport reading or airport reads isn't really a thing. It would be quite niche, but I think if there was anything I read this month, I think this would be a perfect book to read in between flights, to really hit you with that sort of nihilistic and existential dread. I don't know, I think it's just for me reading this surrounded by so many strangers, where this book sort of talks about mainly the relationships between people. I think it hit a lot harder for me, and I really enjoyed it because I think in probably the longest time, this is the book or a book that I've underlined very frequently in a lot of different parts. Near to the Wild Heart is translated from the Portuguese, and it's about this girl named Joanna who we get to know through childhood and adulthood, primarily with her concerns with finding relationships she's comfortable with, or to me at least, ones that mimic such the positive experience she had with her relationship with her father. But after Joanna's father dies, she does sort of bounce to different family members or relatives, and to put it quite frankly, they think Joanna is quite weird, and so Joanna, that sort of stays with her, these ideas about relationships and how to be somewhat normal, and that follows her into whenever she gets married, and then that's really where sort of everything culminates into Joanna thinking about essentially what is the meaning of existence. If you're really into people like Joyce or Woolf, I think you'd really like this book. I think a lot of people would like this book if they're trying to tap into that sort of stream of consciousness style, but one that isn't quite, at least to me, intimidating, but one that is surprisingly, I think, profound without being, for the lack of a better term, senseless. I think this book just really gets straight to the point, and I think that's why I like it so much too. Another book I read, and actually the first book I read this month, was a short story collection called A Manual for Cleaning Women by Lucia Berlin. It really amazes me how I feel like I've read so many stories that give that illusion of being very simple, but there's just so much more to them, and I thought by now, whenever I read those type of stories, that they wouldn't affect me as much, but I really felt, in a way, I guess I could say, seduced by these stories for how impactful they are despite their length, but also because I think the characters and the themes serve each other so well and so evenly. There are a lot of moments in these stories that beckon sort of ideas of choice and idleness and one's beliefs, and mainly surrounded by issues like class and also things commonly that women have to deal with, since a lot of these narrators in these stories are women. And there always seems to be this one key factor in each story that, of course, you would think is sort of the climax of it probably, but they feel so genuine and not expected with how they affect the character after. For example, there are stories in here about abortion, another story about someone going into a shed and killing these dogs, or even a story of hanging out with your communist teacher. I think with all of these, there's such a thematic patience that Lucia Berlin is so good at crafting and letting the reader pace very well along, despite how short these stories are already. I feel like you could reread a lot of these stories, but just thinking of them from different characters' perspectives and how that might affect your own reading experience of these stories, but I couldn't recommend this more enough. I think this is, in a way, an essential collection if you're into short stories. Another short story collection I read this month that did not favor as well with me was A Lucky Man by Brinkley. It's really sad because I think I realized reading this right after A Manual for Cleaning Women that I think, to me, a bad short story is one that serves the theme first and the character second. In a lot of stories in this collection for A Lucky Man, I did find the stories repetitive themselves, and with those themes, I think they became transparent more and more as I kept reading each different story. There was also this technique that Brinkley does where he often in the story uses a memory to propel the story, and so it goes back in time. And to me, I think that's a bit lazy. I think it's a way for the endings of these stories, which I also thought were a bit clumsy, to not have that full closure that I thought they deserved. Which is a shame, because I think with these stories, there is that importance of being able to talk about things like male masculinity, being a person of color. And what I especially liked, I feel like these stories, what they were trying to talk about is the illusion of race affecting your family self and then also your not family self. It doesn't really make sense how I describe it like that, but being someone in my own family and being a person of color, I sort of felt like I could relate to this thing I was sort of clinging on, where a lot of these characters felt like who they were inside their family was effective to how they saw the world and how the world treated them. I will say that I think Brinkley has a lot of potential for his future work. I think this was a debut, and so I think it sort of read that way, but I'm still excited for his future work, but I would pass on this one. Another book I read is All of Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. Now that I think about it with this book, I think it really is fitting that the title of this work is All of Kitteridge, who is a character in these to me, I sort of read this almost as a short story collection, although I know it's marketed as a novel, but this book takes place in this town and we get to know insights from different people that live there, and I'm a sucker for small town politics. So in that way, I really enjoyed this book, but I also think it's important to know why is it called All of Kitteridge if she seems like just one small thread between all of these people. And I think it's because Olive's character, out of everybody, she's the only one that makes it so clear and explicit what she wants, how she wants it, and why. Many of these characters we find out wish they could live in some sort of double life or wish that their opportunities in life were different or more available to them. And as the years pass, there is a lot of commentary on what does it mean to be in a marriage for so long? How do we age and how do we cope with that? But there were other times in here that I thought some situations or plots were a bit less profound. If you've read this book, one example that I won't spoil, but you probably know what I'm talking about, is the scene at the hospital, so I'll just leave it at that. I think it was a bit too far-fetched for me. I thought it was providing drama for the sake of drama, just to pull the story along. So in that way, I feel like reading Elizabeth Strout, if some of you might remember, I read her last month in December with My Name is Lucy Barton. And I would recommend reading My Name is Lucy Barton first, just to get a taste to see if All of Kitteridge is maybe right for you. But at the same time, thinking about it, I don't know if I would have read My Name is Lucy Barton, because that whole book feels like it could have just been its own character in this book, All of Kitteridge, as well. However, despite that, I do think that Elizabeth Strout is really good at creating characterization and, again, sort of inhabiting people in universes and creating this small town full of very rich personalities. Another book I read this month was actually a novella, and that is The Sense of an Ending by Julian Barnes. This is a story about a man named Tony who is well into his middle-aged years as he sort of reflects on the past about how different pathways in his life could have maybe led to different outcomes, primarily with finding out that his old friend has recently committed suicide. And I will say that Tony is a piece of work because he is this very sarcastic guy who's also a loner, but it seems like, to me, the idea I had while reading this book is wondering whether or not Tony is the one that pushes people away, or he has this very desperate way of wanting people close to him, but is sort of determining why. And even though I mentioned about this story containing a friend's suicide, I thought that the book would actually dive into that more, but I was pleasantly surprised that no matter what, this book is about Tony, so no one can really get that wrong. It's more about Tony sort of realizing what his mistakes are, primarily I think with women, but ultimately also with friendship. We soon find out with Tony describing these different times in his life that it's up to him to sort of piece together the sort of mystery that his friend left behind concerning all these different people that know each other. And I think I like the beginning of this book a lot more than the second half, mainly because it starts to get in that territory where a lot of things could have just been resolved with clear communication. And with Tony, particularly his whole problems with women, I didn't really care about at all. And there is sort of a twist at the end, which I guess was fine, but I didn't really welcome it. I didn't think it was entirely necessary to the whole sort of tone of the book. I felt much more like with how Tony was approaching sort of the resolution at the end, if it had been more about Tony and this character named Veronica and them talking more rather than about sort of how things were left behind and how they can be resolved years later. I know that this book is about the passage of time and what it means to get older, and I think those things were very clear, and I can see why people like it so much. One might even say it's that old saying that the journey is the destination, which I took away from this book, but as the title might suggest, the whole idea of a sense of an ending, I think being in that sort of purgatory of not knowing the difference between a new beginning and an ending, I think is really rich with this story and something I like to sort of sit on and meditate about. I think overall I would recommend this book to people. I don't think it really did a lot for me, but I still appreciate it. I did read a graphic novel this month, and it is Sweet Tooth, and this was recommended to me by a friend actually, and I think it's really, I was pleasantly surprised by this one. This is an apocalyptic story where it's mainly about these hybrid people that become half human and half animal, and they're sort of like this treasure in this world. We don't really know why in this first installment, but it definitely provided enough intrigue that makes me want to read future works. And being in this apocalyptic world, I really like the idea that I think that the story was trying to say, how do we define friendship? Is friendship an essence of survival, or is it something we willingly sort of let ourselves fall into? So yeah, I would recommend Sweet Tooth. I can't really say much more about it because I don't know how the story fully ends, but I'm definitely going to be reading more of it in the future. And finally, the last book I read this month was I Might Regret This by Abbi Jacobson. In case you don't know, Abbi Jacobson is the co-star of the hit show that is so funny, Broad City, and I didn't really know a lot about Abbi Jacobson before I read this, but this book sort of takes on the linear, I put that in quotes loosely, linear structure of Abbi Jacobson taking this sort of cross-country road trip from the East Coast to the West Coast to sort of find herself. The way I would recommend this book to people is if you liked Wild by Cheryl Strayed, this is just a much more lighthearted Wild. Cheryl Strayed actually gives a little blurb on the cover of this book, which I thought was really cool, but there are just situations in this book that are so funny and things that I would definitely do. For example, Abbi is at this job before Broad City and she's trying to quit, and then her supervisor asks her right after she tries to quit to go install a DVD at her boss's house, and Abbi Jacobson does it. So while there are those funny sort of essays in there, I do think the essays that succeed are the much longer ones that really sort of chronicle Jacobson's journey to Broad City and the ones about her co-star Alana. I was really pleasantly surprised by how vulnerable and intimate that Jacobson gets, trying to articulate how this trip she's taking is a giant way of trying to discover how she perceives relationships, and whether that be business connections in the business world with Broad City or just personal relationships where she discovers more about her sexuality and also how she sees her friends and friendships. Although there do feel like some parts in this collection that feel a bit like filler, primarily any of the essays or parts that contained lists, I sort of glazed over because I think lists are a bit of a cheap way to produce content in books like this, mainly because it leaves a lot of room for sort of making up things probably that you want to, because Jacobson talks about how she can't sleep very well, and so she makes these timestamps where what her internal monologue is, which I find hard to believe. But otherwise, I would recommend this book to people, especially if you're feeling like that lost 20, 30, 40, however old you are something. I think Jacobson accidentally articulates that feeling very well without making anyone feel pity for you, and it's really just about her own journey and her own sense of, in a way, trying to define who she is, because I think what a lot of people would perceive of her is that maybe she's not as well of herself without Alana beside her. This collection is funny, it is full of heart, it is impulsive at times, but it's also full of passion. So I'd really recommend this if you're a fan of Broad City. It's definitely in that feel-good category, which is definitely what I'm looking for right now. So those are all the books I read in January. Please let me know if you've read any of these books and what you plan to read maybe for February. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.